My name is Alexandra Gheciu. I am the director of SIPS, Center for International Policy Studies, and I am happy and honored to welcome all of you to today's event, which centers on a lecture by our very special guest, Mr. Tariq Rauf, who's a leading global expert on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. It truly is a privilege to welcome him to SIPS, and I would like to sincerely congratulate him on the very important work that he carries out to advance international security, and also in anticipation for the special award that he will receive today. Let me please mention that this event is co-sponsored by SIPS and Canadians for a Nuclear Weapons Convention. So I would like to thank our friends from the CNWC for working with SIPS on this and so many other events, and truly for their constant and important work to advance the norm of prohibition of nuclear weapons. Mr. Rauf's lecture will focus not only on the heightened risks generated by the large and constantly, quote unquote, modernizing nuclear arsenals of great powers, but also on some of the policies that the international community could take to help us make meaningful progress toward a world free of nuclear weapons. And I really cannot think of a more important topic in a context in which ongoing tensions and conflicts, perhaps most notably, the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine and the what could be seen as irresponsible nuclear threats that are still being articulated in Moscow, remind us all that sadly, the threat of potential use of nuclear weapons remains alarmingly real. And in this context, I am especially grateful to our very special guest that he has chosen a title that gives us a sense of hope, that all is not lost, even in a world in which we seem to receive so many bad news every day, and in which the sense of hope can sometimes be very difficult to sustain. Now, before inviting Mr. Rauf to deliver his important lecture, I would like to invite back to SIPS an old friend who is also someone who has been very active in working towards nuclear disarmament. I speak, of course, of Ernie Regier, who's an officer of the Order of Canada, co-chair of the CNWC, co-founder and former executive director of Project Plowshares, as well as senior fellow at the Simons Foundation Canada and research fellow at the Center for Peace Advancement at Conrad Grebel University College, University of Waterloo. Over the years, Ernie and his colleagues have worked constantly and tirelessly to keep alive this vision of a world free of nuclear weapons. And for this, I think we all owe him a huge debt of gratitude. So thank you so much, Ernie. Thank you for being here. I hope you consider SIPS as one of your intellectual homes. Thank you for coming back. Once again, thank you all so much for joining us today for this important and exciting event. And so without further ado, let me please invite Ernie to please take the floor and say a few words about today's event. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gheciu. Really appreciate it. It is terrific to be here at SIPS again. We've done a number of events over the years together with SIPS and you and your colleague Anna Bojic, who's on her iPad or taking a picture just now. That's so terrifically helpful in arranging all of this and providing this terrific facility. It's a great room for this, and it's great for CNWC. It expands our reach and engages us with the academic community as well as the civil society community that we operate in. Let me say just a couple of things about CNWC, Canadians for Nuclear Weapons Convention. This is a project begun close to roughly 15 years ago, Our late colleague, Murray Thompson, was heavily involved in that. And we are a project of the Canadian Pugwash Group. And the Canadian Pugwash Group is in turn affiliated with the International Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs. That organization and the leader at the time, Joseph Rothblatt, won the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1990s. And this is all named after a little village in Nova Scotia, Pugwash. And if you may be familiar with the story, but if you're not, it's worth a Google search to see the connection between that village and this international movement. The objective of CNWC, of course, is to urge on Canada a much more engaged and active involvement in international nuclear disarmament, diplomacy, and action. Canada has at times been quite active in this whole field, and it's a bit quiescent at the moment, to put it kindly. And part of our effort is to encourage a much more intense involvement. It's our sense that there's been far too little recognition about the perilous state that we're in, and the dangers of nuclear weapons use growing as a result of the war that you mentioned. So we have a website, and for more information on that, I invite you to Google that at CNWC. That will get you to the website. I mean, the focus of CNWC is disarmament policy and engagement broadly, but a particular contribution that we bring to is an emphasis on the need for a nuclear weapons convention. That is a legal instrument that would gather together all of the agreements and laws and treaties and arrangements, including verification arrangements that were needed to carry out what is an official Canadian objective, and that is a world without nuclear weapons. That's Canadian policy, and we need a little bit more intense work in that regard. And the last thing I'll say about CNWC is that our kind of niche activity is to engage the Canadians who have been recipients of the Order of Canada, and it's a reach out to those accomplished and in many cases influential Canadians who have endorsed not only CNWC but endorsed the active pursuit of policies and measures towards a world without nuclear weapons. And about a little over 1,000 of those Order of Canada recipients have endorsed the work and signed letters and that kind of thing. So that brings me to introduce Doug Roach. He will be he'll be familiar to all of you, and so doesn't need an introduction. But you know him as a journalist, as a parliamentarian, as a diplomat, as an author. Just a brand new book out in the last week or so. A valued colleague to to many of us, and a singular leader of the disarmament movement in Canada and far beyond Canada's borders, and friend. And I'm going to call on Doug now to introduce our speaker and to present the award to Tariq Rauf.
Roth, our guest of honor here, be seated. Dear friends, Ambassador Alexander Clement of Austria, known to a number of persons in this room, is one of the foremost exponents of nuclear disarmament in the world. He served as the president of the first meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So when I mentioned to Ambassador Clement that the Canadians for Nuclear Weapons Convention was presenting its annual Distinguished Achievement Award this year to Tariq Rauf, his eyes lit up. Well, he said, you couldn't have chosen a more worthy recipient. And then he began to recount some attributes of our honoree today that I don't think you will find in the official biography of Tariq Rauf. Ambassador Clement said, and I quote, Tariq is a treasure trove of knowledge on all things nuclear, and his experience and expertise on the NPT and IAEA safeguards in particular are unrivaled. He is passionate about the nuclear weapons issue and on maintaining and strengthening the international regime. And, I'm still quoting the ambassador, this passion makes him merciless in pointing out hypocrisies, double standards, and factually false arguments. Tariq, the ambassador says, speaks truth to nuclear power. So much that some powerful nuclear actors try to avoid having to listen to him, most probably since they would always be hard-pressed to counter his sharp analyses. Ambassador Clement continued, the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime is under threat. Tariq is one of the most eminent and effective experts trying to counter these negative developments. We urgently need him to continue to do this. So, Tariq, tonight you're going to receive the award that's meant to continue to give you encouragement to continue your role. Tariq is the former head of verification and security policy, the alternate head of the NPT delegation at the International Atomic Energy Agency. And he was a staff member when the agency received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005. More recently, he served as a senior advisor to the chair of the Main Committee 1 at the 2015 NPT Review Conference. At the invitation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan, Tariq served as a member of the group of eminent persons for substantive advancement of nuclear disarmament. He has contributed to the work of the Evans Kawaguchi International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, the Tokyo Forum for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. Also, he was the director of the Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Programme at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. and he served as a consultant for policy and outreach in the Office of the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. And he's currently a Vienna-based member of the Board of Directors of Atomic Reporters and the International Advisory Council of the International Luxembourg Forum on Preventing Nuclear Catastrophe. In the spare time that he has, I don't know when that is, he also mentors young diplomats in nuclear disarmament topics. My earliest memories of Tariq go back to when he served as an expert and advisor with Canada's delegation to the NPT conferences. He played a key role in the 1995 Review and Extension Conference. And when he also appeared before Canada's parliamentary committees on foreign affairs and national defense. He was Senior Research Associate at the Canadian Centre for Arms Control and Disarmament in Ottawa, and subsequently Director of the International Organizations and Non-Proliferation Programme at Monterey Institute of International Studies. He received his education at the University of the Punjab, the University of London, the London School of Economics, and King's College London, and at Carleton and the University of Toronto. So it is for me a distinct honor and a pleasure to present this year's CNWC Award for Distinguished Achievement to Tariq Rauf.
So thank you very much, everyone. I would like to thank the Canadian Network for a Nuclear Weapons Convention for this award, and I'm very proud to join the ranks of distinguished Canadians committed to peace and security of Canada and the world without nuclear weapons who have received this award in preceding years. In particular, I would like to thank my friend and mentor and recognize the Honorable Douglas Roach, Order of Canada, former Senator, Member of Parliament, Ambassador for Disarmament, Prophet for Peace, author, who has been a long-standing friend and who has shown years of untiring energy and dedication to promote Canada as a middle power in pursuit of ridding the world of nuclear weapons. Thank you, Doug, for your persistence and keeping up hope even in the worst of times. And I would also like to thank and recognize Ernie Reguer, who's also a recipient of the Order of Canada, co-chair of CNWC and co-founder and former executive director of Project Plowshares. He was my introduction to a peace agenda and nonviolent resolution of disputes. Project Plowshares, under his visionary leadership, was a strong civil society voice for beating swords into plowshares. So thank you very much, Ernie. And I would also like to thank Dr. Alexandre Reguechiu, professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and director of the Center for International Policy Studies here at the University of Ottawa, for graciously hosting this event. Doug already let out the secret that I was enrolled at the other university in town, but of course, both universities are equally distinguished, so thank you very much for having me here. My professional journey began at the then Canadian Centre for Arms Control and Disarmament, which was located at the corner of Slater and Kent Streets, which was set up by John Lamb with the funding support of then External Affairs and International Trade Canada, to serve as an independent source of information and policy inputs on Canadian and global nuclear arms control and disarmament. This commendable vision of the Canadian government of the day through EAITC to partially fund and support the CCACD was implemented at a higher level when Ambassador Peggy Mason included me and my then colleague Marie-France Desjardins in the Canadian delegation to the NPT Review Conference. This was then followed by Ambassador Chris Westall, whom I accompanied both in 1995 and in 2000. In 1995, among my duties for Chris was to arrange his working lunches at the Leopard restaurant in New York, where he would work his magic on states that did not support indefinite extension to change their mind and come over to our side. At that time, the NPT had 178 parties, and I was given the task of collecting signatures from heads of delegations supporting indefinite extensions. So we needed a majority, which out of 178, we needed 90 votes. But unfortunately, somewhere around 60, the going got hard. But eventually, we did manage to get 111 signatures, which were sitting under my chair when the final decisions and resolution were adopted to make the NPT of indefinite duration. So I don't know whether Chris is here. Oh, there he is. So I'd like to thank Chris. In 2000, he essentially left me alone to work with Conference President Abdullah Bali to work on the strengthened review process. I would not wish on anyone, and I think Chris will remember the pungent stink of the admixture of human body odor, cigarette smoke, and cheap lotions in the small conference room where we negotiated until 2 or 3 o'clock at night. Ambassador Paul Meyer was also part of the EAITC team at that time, which supported the Canadian Centre. So I'm also very grateful to him. I remember accompanying Ambassador Meyer to the first Article 14 conference on the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to promote its universality. And I still recall that the final declaration, which along the lines of the Soviet Union had already been crafted before the meeting took place, was being steadily watered down in order that everyone could agree to it. So I'd also like to thank Paul for his commitment to our cause. I also want to remember two persons who are no longer with us. One is my dear friend, Ambassador Mark Moher, sadly not now with us, who was a strong supporter with other colleagues at the ministry of an independent think tank and to promote independent Canadian thinking. He was a strong defender of Canada's positions at the Conference on Disarmament and in other forums. And at the 1998 NPT conference, he did not back down, despite strong opposition from one of Canada's strongest allies on promoting what we call then a state of the NPT statement to come out of each NPT preparatory committee meeting. I was proud to continue his legacy, and starting in 2007, we did start to get something along the lines of the state of the NPT, which we call Chair's Reflections. And I'm very glad to see that Jennifer Moher, his daughter, is here. So thank you very much for being here, Jennifer. Also sadly missed is Sven Yushevsky, who was also a foreign affairs diplomat. He was an iconoclast with a bohemian demeanor, but a razor-sharp mind, who was part of the Canadian delegation in 1995. So both Mark and Sven are no longer with us, but I wanted to pay tribute to them. There are many other friends and colleagues to thank: Bev DeLong, Adele Buckley, Firdaus Kharas, Cesar, and others. And given not enough time, I won't list all of them, but I'm very grateful to all of you for your support and friendship. And thank you to everyone for coming to this event. So I titled my talk, Ending the Perpetual Menace of Nuclear Weapons. Following the Trinity nuclear detonation on the 16th of July, 1945, nuclear scientist Leo Szilard, who was part of the team along with Oppenheimer, he observed, quote, "Almost without exception, all the creative physicists had misgivings about the use of the bomb." He added that Truman did not understand at all what was involved regarding nuclear weapons, end of quote. These days, the movie Oppenheimer has been the rage based on a noteworthy biography of Robert Oppenheimer entitled American Prometheus, written by historians Sky Bird and Martin Sherwin. Though the movie spares its viewers the horrors of the atomic bombing of Japan, it does reflect the warnings of the early nuclear weapon scientists about the long-term permanent damage and dangers of nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race associated with the further development of nuclear weapons. The film unfortunately overlooks other historical works, including A World Destroyed, Hiroshima and Its Legacies, also by the historian Martin Sherwin, that disputes and negates the US government's narrative about the necessity of using nuclear weapons twice over civilian targets in Japan, and suggests that the decisions were driven mainly by geostrategic and prestige considerations, criteria still in operation today to justify continuing retention of nuclear weapons. Incidentally, historians Bird and Sherwin, in entitling their biography Oppenheimer as the American Prometheus, did an injustice by not crediting Lise Meitner and Otto Hahn, who were the actual discoverers of atomic fission. And the Nobel Committee at the time gave the prize to Otto Hahn, but not to Lise Meitner. Unfortunately, now the contribution of Lise Meitner and Marie Curie to atomic physics is being recognized through scholarships given at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Leo Szilard's observation that I just cited a few moments ago that President Truman did not understand at all what was involved regarding nuclear weapons, unfortunately still rings true when it comes to the leaders of today's nuclear weapon possessor states, as well as most of their diplomats and those of the 30+ countries in military defense arrangements that are underpinned with nuclear weapons. Now, why do I say this? From the 24th of July to the 11th of August this year, I was an official delegate at the meetings in Vienna of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, both a working group on the review process and a preparatory committee for the next NPT Review Conference. After 15 days of debates, consultations, and negotiations, the result was precisely nothing, zero. No agreement on any measures, however small, to try to reduce the present and continuing anthropogenic existential risks of atomic weapons. This year's session of the NPT meetings overlapped with the 6th and 8th of August, which are the anniversaries of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At a side event, and to some delegates, I suggested to mark the occasion in the NPT meeting with a 1-minute silence for reflection in the memory of all those affected by nuclear weapons over the past 8 decades, those who were the victims of the atomic bombings, but also those who are the living victims of nuclear weapons testing in various parts of the world. But unfortunately, the diplomats were not willing to observe this because I think this would have brought the truth too close to them, and they wouldn't have liked to see their faces in the mirror in terms of the dangers that are out there and what was their output at this meeting. At this meeting in Vienna, there were also several divides between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, between nuclear weapon states and various political and issue-based coalitions. Most remarkable, in my view, was the astounding statement by Netherlands, Italy, and Germany, 3 of the 5 NATO non-nuclear weapon states that host nuclear weapons in Europe and are charged with nuclear warfighting missions should war break out in Europe and NATO will be engaged in an active conflict. And just last week, NATO conducted Steadfast Noon, a full-fledged nuclear warfighting exercise to ensure the credibility, effectiveness, and security of our nuclear deterrent. Now, what did Netherlands, Italy, and Germany say that was so astounding? They said, quote, NATO's nuclear arrangements have always been and continue to be fully consistent with the NPT and were put in place well before the NPT entered into force in 1970. This resulted in a seamless integration of NATO nuclear sharing arrangements into the NPT, which has long been accepted and publicly understood by all states parties to the NPT, end of quote. So when one stops laughing at this ludicrous claim, it is clear now that NATO states hosting nuclear weapons find themselves under increasing pressure and losing credibility. These ill-founded claims did not go unanswered by some other states, though unfortunately several states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in the room chose not to engage on this particular matter, in their view, to avoid provoking further reaction from the weapon states and their allies against the TPNW. The nuclear weapon states were loath to accept any benchmarks, targets, or timelines for nuclear disarmament last August. The new flavor of the day is the amorphous concept of nuclear risk reduction, which is being supported by at least 3 of the 5 nuclear weapon states and many of their allies. And also some think tanks, mostly those that are receiving funds from government sources. And I would recommend to you reading this article by Benoit Pelopidas, who's a professor at Sciences Po, in Paris, and the title of his article is "No Free Lunch." And if you Google it, you'll find out that 20 of the world's leading think tanks in our field are receiving government funding and military funding of some sort, and not all, but much of their research supports their government policy instead of providing independent thought and thinking on these issues. I'm glad that nearly a month ago, on 25th September, marking the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres clearly stated, the only way to eliminate the nuclear risk is to eliminate nuclear weapons, and urged countries to work together to banish these devices of destruction to the history books once and for all. Now, reverting back to nearly 8 decades ago, emerging from the ashes of the Second World War, the very first resolution adopted by the General Assembly in 1946 was to eliminate atomic and other weapons of mass destruction. So the first seeds of warning about the effects of nuclear weapons and the existential risks posed by nuclear weapons were already sounded at the very beginning in the very first assembly meeting of the General Assembly. However, despite the efforts of many scientists and diplomats, the first resolution was never really fully implemented, and we went on to develop many hundreds and then thousands of nuclear weapons. You would be surprised to note that in 1958, there was even a short-lived project to detonate a thermonuclear device on the surface of the moon. And the rationale was to produce a very large mushroom cloud or a brilliant super flash that could be observed from Earth. And that would be an obvious show of strength to the Soviet Union. Fortunately, this project was canceled, the moon was spared, and we have the Moon Treaty, which prohibits nuclear weapons deployment and testing on the moon and other celestial objects. So during the next decades, more than 2,060 nuclear weapon test detonations have taken place all over the world. At the first meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons last year, in June, I was asked to chair a session on victim assistance and environmental remediation, the personal testimonies of a Kazakh man with no arms, and another man with jelly bones, and a Marshall Islander with genetic damage, and also the young granddaughter of a Hiroshima survivor who wore her survivor grandmother's kimono to the meeting, was a living testimony of the lasting effects of nuclear weapons testing and the damage done both to humans and to the environment. And I would have very much wished that officials from Global Affairs Canada who were present in Vienna for the meeting on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons did not stay on to attend this first meeting of the states parties to the TPNW. So today is the 23rd of October. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted from 16 to 28 October 1962. It's well worth remembering how close the Soviet Union and the United States came to starting a nuclear war. During the crisis, US Air Force General Curtis LeMay, who was the Second World War advocate of carpet bombing of cities, told President Kennedy that, quote, "We should go in and wipe them out today. Ultimately, we're going to confront these people in a conflict with nuclear weapons, and by God, we'd better do it when we have greater superiority than we will have in the future," end of quote. Little did LeMay know that at the time there were 162 nuclear warheads, including 90 tactical warheads deployed by the Soviets in Cuba. And at the time, there was at least one Soviet submarine with nuclear armed torpedoes in the region. So had Kennedy followed Curtis LeMay's advice, we probably would not be here today. The elders, former internationally respected world leaders, have warned that as long as nuclear weapons remain in existence, it is inevitable that they will someday be used, whether by design, by accident, or miscalculation. Contrast this with the NATO summit and NATO's nuclear doctrine, which says NATO should remain a nuclear alliance as long as nuclear weapons exist. Interestingly, UN Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson has said that there are no right hands for wrong weapons, and weapons of mass destruction are simply wrong. Now, unfortunately, the vision of ridding the world of nuclear weapons is receding as the nuclear arms control architecture that was built up patiently during the past 50 years is collapsing before our very eyes. 2 non-proliferation treaty review conferences have failed to reach an outcome in 2015 and last year. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty has not yet entered into force. Just a couple of days ago, the Russian Duma de-ratified Russia's ratification of the CTBT. On that very day, the United States conducted a subcritical test at Nevada. So we can see that there are pressures already on the CTBT, and we are not sure whether this treaty will enter into force or will survive. At the moment, we are at the mercies of the nuclear weapon possessor states observing moratoria on nuclear testing, but again, we don't know how this will last. And this is, I think, something where Canada needs to be more active as a champion for disarmament and also a champion of the CTBT. And I have not heard strong statements coming out of Ottawa on the preservation of the CTBT following Russia's re-ratification and also the subcritical test carried out in Nevada. On fissile material control, nuclear weapons require highly enriched uranium and plutonium. Without these two fissile materials, we cannot have nuclear weapons. Now, at the Atomic Energy Agency, where I worked, for safeguard purposes, we categorized 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and 8 kilograms of plutonium as sufficient for one nuclear weapon and as one measure for verifying nuclear material in non-nuclear weapon states. So how much nuclear material is there? Today, it is estimated that there are nearly 1,500 tons of highly enriched uranium and 500 tons of plutonium. A ton is 1,000 kilograms. So we have nearly 2 million kilograms of weapon-usable material completely outside any international oversight, accountability, or monitoring. And we have had 5 nuclear security summits, 1996 in Moscow, 2010 in Washington, 2012 in Seoul, 2014 in The Hague, and 2016 in Washington again. And only 17% of the world's nuclear materials are under international monitoring by the IAEA. 83% are in military use and could be used potentially to make 130,000 nuclear weapons. So if we are to have a fissile material cutoff treaty, which has been on the books for many decades, we need to find a way to bring this material on the table. Now, fortunately, Canada has tabled a new resolution at this year's first committee, which calls on the nuclear, on possessor states with the fissile material to engage in transparency amongst themselves. I hope this effort succeeds, although it's very unlikely that China and some others would play ball on this, but nonetheless, I would like to commend Canada on this issue for taking a good leadership role. Now, the basic fundamentals of the bilateral arms control regime, which was created in the 1960s following the Cuban Missile Crisis with the basic principles, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and so on, all of that is under threat, as I mentioned. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty came to an end in 2019, and under this treaty, nearly 2,000 intermediate and shorter range missiles were taken offline, and 5,000 nuclear warheads were also taken offline. While the missiles were dismantled, the warheads were not dismantled under the process of the treaty. Now, recently, Russia has warned in the first committee that were the US to deploy INF systems in Europe, Russia would do the same. And the US has also given a reverse warning back to Russia that were it to deploy intermediate range weapons closer to NATO's borders, then the US would also respond. The New START agreement between the two is the sole surviving strategic arms reduction treaty between Moscow and Washington. But this its implementation has been suspended first by Russia and then by the United States. So the latest data exchange, the data exchange has also been suspended by Russia. So the latest data exchange that we have is for September 2022, which shows that Russia had 1,549 warheads. The limit is 1,550 and the start on 540 launches, and the limit and the start is 700 launches. And the United States are 1,420 warheads on 650 launches. And the US provided the latest data in March, which is 1,419 warheads on 662 launches. And I'll tell you a minute why I'm boring you with these numbers. Now, were New START to collapse? It is supposed to expire on the 5th of February 2006, a few months before the 11th NPT Review Conference. So were the treaty to collapse, both Russia and the United States, without making a single new ballistic missile or a single new ballistic missile submarine or a single new strategic bomber, could easily double the loadings on their existing delivery systems of warheads. Instead of 1,550, there would be somewhere around 3,500 or more. So were this to happen, this would make the situation even more dangerous. And as you know, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has already moved the doomsday clock to 90 seconds before the midnight of Armageddon. Now, China is also building up, and the latest US estimate is that by the end of this decade, China could have as much as twice as many nuclear weapons, roughly 1,000, and by 2030, about 1,550, which is the current limit of deployed warheads between Russia and the United States. Now, China at the moment is not prepared to engage on nuclear arms control issues, and it's pushing back that until the US and Russia cut back, China will not come to the table. Now, another area of danger is the continuing dangerous military activities in the air and in the sea. We have these old agreements from the Cold War, prevention of dangerous military activities, prevention of incidents at sea. But both in the Pacific theater and also in the European theater, every day, Russian, American, and Chinese planes are coming within very close proximity and engaging in very dangerous maneuvers. Although there have been recent statements by the G7, by the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapon states, the G20, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought, or the use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, while these statements are welcome, they are not backed up by any actions. And so while we can commend the leaders for having these statements, we need to press them for taking actions commensurate with their statements in terms of de-alerting, giving commitments of no first use of nuclear weapons, reducing the number of nuclear weapons that are already deployed. None of that is happening. There is no change in current deployments, in current modernization programs. It's only empty words. So why did I title my talk, Ending the Perpetual Menace of Nuclear Weapons? I did so by taking my cues from a masterful book by Professor William Walker of St. Andrews University, who wrote this book to mark his retirement, entitled A Perpetual Menace, Nuclear Weapons and International Order. Few have thought longer or harder on the impact of nuclear weapons on international order than William Walker during his academic career. He took the book's title from a famous quote of Niels Bohr, 1944 memorandum to Franklin Roosevelt, in which Bohr had advised, quote, any temporary advantage of using nuclear weapons, however great, may be outweighed by a perpetual menace to human society. Both Bohr and Walker shared a sensibility about the bomb as well as an informed aversion to policy decisions governing its evolution. Regarding the nuclear futures on which Walter, echoing Bohr, places considerable weight is how forcefully and steadfastly nuclear abolition is to be pursued. Their thinking has been echoed by Ambassador Alexander Clement, whom Doug just quoted. And in this context, the question is, where is the justice for anyone if the maintenance of nuclear forces for the purpose of security results through accident or intent in its annihilation? So closing in on the centenary of the invention of nuclear weapons in 2045 and the twice use of nuclear weapons, what can we do? While at the moment, the scene seems to be rather barren, one thing that we could consider is to have a repeat of the 1958 conference on the prevention of a surprise attack. And I think it would be quite timely in the context of the agenda for the future of the Secretary General and the Summit for the Future to also focus on the dangers of surprise attack and avoidance of accidental war. And we've also had such a conference in the past several decades ago, which many diplomats are not aware of. And even in bad times, we have had arms control negotiations. When the NPT was open for signature, Soviet tanks were rampaging through Prague. That did not stop the NPT. We have had other times when you had Russians in Afghanistan, we still had a strategic arms limitation agreement. So while it is very unfortunate that we have armed conflicts going on in some certain parts of the world, that does not mean that not negotiating on arms control is a reward, that negotiating on arms control is a reward to the adversary. We negotiate with our adversaries, we don't negotiate with our friends. Arms control and disarmament is part of national security strategy, it's part of threat reduction. And this is something, again, that is unfortunately fallen by the wayside. Although there is one glimmer of hope, in June, the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, made a number of proposals, and notably he said that the United States is willing to engage both with Russia and with China separately without conditions, but with accountability on next steps on nuclear arms control and disarmament, and also enhancing and improving strategic stability. At the moment, there has not been any response back from the Russian Federation, and I think this is again one area where Canada could encourage the US, Russia, and China to come to the table to talk about these issues and at least make a beginning on the next stage of nuclear arms control. So to end, I would like to point out that one of the criticisms for nuclear disarmament is that we know relatively little about the drivers for nuclear weapons relinquishment. And there is no consensus about how the elimination of nuclear arms might be accomplished in practice, and that the political dynamics of nuclear disarmament are understudied and under-theorized, and that there is no theory of nuclear disarmament. So perhaps, Alexandra, this is a topic for some of your PhD students to develop a theory. The advocates of nuclear disarmament diplomacy often justify their positions with references to historical examples that are posited to provide lessons for disarmament policy. We have only 4 cases where states have relinquished nuclear weapons. But of those 4 cases, there is only one which actually manufactured the weapons itself and then dismantled them. The other 3 had stationed nuclear weapons on their territory. So that's Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. And the one country that made nuclear weapons and then dismantled them on its own is South Africa. So we need to build on these few examples if we are to move further. So there have been a number of international projects on verification of the dismantlement of nuclear warheads. There's the so-called UK-Norway exercise. There is an agreement with arrangement called the Quad, which involves Sweden, Norway, the UK, and the United States. There's another arrangement led by the United States that involves Canada. It's called the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification. But the point here is that we have 0 experience and 0 methodologies for verifying dismantlement of nuclear warheads. The United States, despite being the champion of IPNDB, which was actually proposed by then Undersecretary Rose Gottemuller at a conference that I was attending as well at Charles University in Prague. The US has said categorically, we will never, ever allow international monitoring or verification of dismantlement of nuclear warheads. So we can do the monitoring and verification on part of the nuclear warhead production cycle, both the pre-production and the post-production, but not the warhead itself. So interesting question here is, you might recall that at the height of the Cold War in 1986, we had more than 70,000 nuclear weapons. In all, more than 120,000 nuclear weapons have been made since 1945, but today we only have 12,500. So what happened to the rest? These weapons were quietly dismantled unilaterally by the states themselves. So there is a very interesting study which goes back to 1993 by the US Office of Technology Assessment entitled Dismantling the Bomb and Managing the Nuclear Materials. So they did a very interesting calculation on how this big number was brought down to today's number of about 12,500. And they estimated that in the 1990s, the average rate of dismantlement in the United States was between 1,400 to 1,500 warheads per year, which is about 110 warheads per month dismantled, which means 4 warheads per day were disassembled. But then as the inventories shrunk, the dismantlement rate declined to about 300 annually. And the estimate provided by the Russian, at that time, Minatom, Ministry of Atomic Energy, was that they were also dismantling between 1,500 to 2,500 warheads, disassembling them per year. And then they reduced their level to 400 to 500 warheads per year as their inventory also declined. There's data available for the UK and France, but in the interest of time, I'll sort of skip over this. So my suggestion is, I do not see in the near future any agreement on a bilateral arms reduction treaty or a multilateral arms reduction treaty. So I would propose to encourage the current possessors of nuclear weapons to find ways of unilaterally reducing and eliminating their arsenals. And we do have a precedent. In 1991, Presidents Bush Sr. and Gorbachev undertook the presidential nuclear initiatives, which removed nuclear weapons from ships and submarines. So the only nuclear weapons at sea are intercontinental submarine-launched ballistic missiles, not nuclear mines, not nuclear-armed torpedoes, and not nuclear-armed cruise missiles. So if this were to be possible, it is quite possible to envisage that by 2045, we could see the dismantlement of these remaining 12,500 nuclear warheads that we have. So can we do this? And I'll sort of echo what Obama said. Yes, we can, provided we compartmentalize the nuclear weapons threat. All of the important arms control treaties that we have reached thus far was because we compartmentalized nuclear issues from other regional conflicts, trade conflicts, human rights issues, and so on. Not that those were not important, but these are the ones that can kill us in short time. So climate change can kill us in 20, 20, 30, 40 years. But as you saw from the video, an accidental nuclear war can kill us in hours or days. So to conclude, the Non-Proliferation Treaty already obliges the weapon states to disarm. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons provides one complementary scheme. At the moment, it's the only thing available on the table. I would argue that we not make the best the enemy of the good, or the good the enemy of the best, whichever way it makes sense. And we can work for further disarmament treaties, but at the moment to focus on what we have and to encourage countries to continue their disassembly of nuclear weapons unilaterally. And then the material coming out of the dismantled warheads can't go under IAEA verification, and a methodology was already developed for monitoring the plutonium coming out of dismantled warheads between the IAEA, between Russia and the United States. And I want to sort of mention to you that when I was still at the CCACD, I did a study for Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, and he became an ardent advocate of it. And I think some of you will probably hate it and want to take this award back, which was that Canada could burn weapons plutonium in CANDU reactors to disposition it away. And Prime Minister Chrétien would go into crowds and say, we're going to burn weapons plutonium for disarmament. And his advisors were completely shocked. This project never really happened. So there are two ways of getting rid of the weapons material. Highly enriched uranium can be diluted. 500 tons of Russian highly enriched uranium sitting in 20,000 warheads aimed at the United States at one point over 20 years provided 25% of the electricity generated in nuclear power reactors in the US. So while we don't support a plutonium economy, if you need to get rid of this material, you need to undergo some short-term pain. So I know this is a very controversial thing. It's not going to happen soon, but there is an agreement between Russia and the United States to get rid of 30 metric tons of plutonium each. It can also be done by direct disposition and burial in the ground. So there are ways of dealing with this. So I sort of chose to focus my talk on this practical aspect of dismantlement of warheads through unilateral measures, rather than in the current context, aiming for new global treaties, which I don't see coming. So I hope you find that an interesting proposal. Thank you very much.